Okay, everyone, it is 8 a.m. and I would like to call the February 22nd Whatcom County Public Utility District Commission regular meeting to order. And the first item on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance, which Chris will be leading us in. So please join us.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Chris. The next item is the approval of the agenda. Are there any proposed changes to the agenda?
Nope.
Okay, great. So I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll make that motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Great. Next.
Hey, can I just real quickly, just because there's a confusion, I think I understood last week. Your Robert's rules and your rules don't require a motion to approve the agenda. You can deem it consented if no one has a motion to amend, but I think Christine's just going to follow the formality of seeking a motion to approve.
Right. Thank you, John. So the next item on the agenda is the consent agenda. So the approval of the meeting minutes from February 8th and the approval of claims for February 22nd.
I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda as it reads.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Great, thank you. Moving on to public comment. Anne, could you please facilitate?
Good morning. Looks like we have Rick Miracle.
Great.
Go
Good
ahead,
morning.
Rick.
Good morning. I just wanted to follow up on my comments from last week about the Snake River dams and Mr. Dejmani's reply to that. Point out that while it is true that the Snake River dams do not provide significant storage for seasonal variations, they do provide quite a bit of storage on a diurnal basis, i.e. night to day, to offset other non-carbon generations such as wind or solar. I would also point out that one, they already exist, and thus building, and if you got rid of that storage, you'd have to build new storage, which of course costs money and has a carbon footprint all of its own. And lastly, the round trip storage discharge efficiency of the Snake River dams of storage is better than other storage such as lithium ion batteries. So from a storage standpoint, again, that's one of those issues that one does not generally hear raised when people are talking about the Snake River dams. And I think it's important that that be kept in mind.
Great. Thank you for your comment, Rick.
And just not as a rebuttal, just to clarify, is that certainly the potential of the Snake River dams for diurnal storage is there. So far, and how they're operated, from what I understand, they haven't been using that capacity. But I think we need to take a look at how we use all of our resources in an integrated fashion to think about it from that perspective, for both supporting the new resources, renewables coming online, but also for maintaining grid reliability with things like frequency services and all that kind of thing. So it's in the old grid, that wasn't that much part of how we thought about the grid. But as time is going on, we have all these intermittent supply sources. There's certainly potential for the Snake River dams to be useful at certain times of the year in that capacity. Chris, do you know if they're using that capacity today?
So typically they're not used for diurnal storage because while they can ramp up when other intermittent sources fall off, they can't ramp down nearly as quickly. They don't plan to do it that way. The other thing I would point out is that if you look at the total round trip efficiency of hydroelectric, what you have to do is calculate the energy of the sunlight that was required to evaporate the water from the ocean that falls on the entire watershed. And you divide that energy, you divide the energy generated by the dam by the energy from the sunlight. And what you find is the round trip efficiency is just a couple of %. So if you actually look at it that way from a round trip perspective, you end up with a very, very bad answer. However, that masks the fact that we've got something that on its own doesn't require carbon to generate energy, and you can never overlook that. It's an existing asset. So with that, I'll be quiet.
I would point out, of course, that the amount of sunlight to evaporate the water from the ocean is going to happen regardless of how we source our power. That happens anyway, regardless.
And I don't have any quibble with that. The issue is if you want to do an engineering efficiency study, you've got to include energy in versus energy out. And then from that particular measure, it's not pretty, but it overlooks all of the facts that you pointed out. So I just wouldn't cite energy round trip efficiency when you're looking at the dams.
Well, I was looking at it only from the point of view of the energy we as human beings had to generate, either by hydro or by solar or by natural gas or whatever. And from that becomes incremental to what happens naturally. And because what happens naturally is going to happen regardless of what we do. And so I'm only looking at it as how much generated energy we have to generate, and whether or not that generates carbon emissions. So on that basis, yeah, we come out ahead using the hydro system to the extent that we can, rather than using lithium-ion batteries.
Thanks. Yeah.
Rick, yeah, thank you for your comment. And we will be talking quite a bit about the future of the electric utility industry today. And I'm sure there'll be more rich discussion on this topic going forward. And are there any other hands raised for public comment right now?
Not right now.
Okay, great. Well, with that, we will close public comment and move on to old business. And as usual, the first item under old business is the broadband program update.
Good morning, commissioners. Chris.
Good morning.
I'll just jump in here real quick just to recap or touch base rather on what we talked about last time involving what's going on with the legislature. Senate Bill 1673, which is regarding the Public Works Board broadband funding and their application process, will be heard by the Senate Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee today at 10:30, and that's moving forward. And WPUD is supportive of that bill, so that's exciting. And Senate Bill 5715 regarding the definition of broadband, and it's being increased from 25.3 to 100 down 20, will be heard today by the House Committee on Community and Economic Development. So just to touch base on those two, we did hear from Would-Be Tell that they're interested in going after a Reconnect 3 grant opportunity for Point Roberts, which would cover roughly 643 locations. So that was pretty exciting for us to hear, and we're supportive of that project for Would-Be Tell. And I'll just share my screen real quick so we can look at a map, which I think we've all seen, but as a reminder, this is the 10 million that the port has secured for these 3 separate projects. And I apologize again, the yellow is kind of hard to see, but Nooksack, North Linden, and the North Ferndale areas. So secured 10 million, excuse me, secured a little more than $10 million, a combination from Community Economic Revitalization Board and the Washington State Broadband Office, as well as County $0.09. There's some port capital contribution to make all of this work, and I'm sure many other partners who have not been mentioned, but good work for everyone involved, and see these projects move forward and implemented in 2023 and completed by 2024. So just to recap, that's where we are. Chris and I are working together now to establish and identify next steps. I'll kick it over to Chris for anything that I may have missed, but a press release went out on this and the news is getting out. So good work, everyone.
And I don't really have anything to add to that except great work, Andrew.
I would just, I have a few things to add to the update. The EDI funds are actually, they were, when we applied for the grants, we said we could get local match, but now that we've won the grants, we need to make sure we get those EDI funds. So Commissioner Michael Shepard and I split up the list of county council members, and over the last few days have been reaching out to all of them to let them know about the project and update them. So I wasn't able to get in touch with Barry Buchanan, but spoke with Councilmember Carol Frazee and Ben Ellenboss. Their finance committee is meeting today to finalize that $2 million that will get us that local match that we said we would get. So I think that they're all really supportive of broadband funding. We'll see how things go in the finance committee today. But that local match from counties does really make a big difference when applying for these grants.
So I'm having a coffee with Barry on non-PUD items on Friday. Assuming that sticks, I'll bring it up. Is that okay?
Yeah, they're voting today on it, but I think it always makes sense to just keep them in the loop about what we're doing and why we pivoted from a backbone approach to a last mile approach, because that was a big topic of discussion for them 6 months ago or so. And so I think everyone's sort of curious to understand what the new model is. And so we talk about broadband a lot more than the county council does. So just kind of continuing to have those conversations is really helpful. That would be great, Commissioner Deshmani. And then the only other thing—
Not worried about today then? You're not worried about today's vote?
Based on my I think that we'll be okay. I mean, if you want to give them a call right after our commission meeting ends, I'm sure that wouldn't hurt. But yeah, I think we'll be okay. And then the only other thing I wanted to say was that I did the WAPUDA virtual day on the Hill, and was in a group with folks from kind of the northern tier of Washington state, and arrearages were a big topic of conversation, but the next topic that was the biggest topic was broadband. And it's really great to see how much bipartisan support there is for broadband funding. So really hoping that we continue to get those pots of funding for loans and grants from CURB and Public Works, because that's what's going to help us continue getting these injections of funds to keep building out. So those are just my two updates, and I assume we'll have a longer conversation in commissioner reports on the WAPUDA meetings that we were all in together. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I had and I'll report that too on my commissioner, but I had an opportunity to sit down with Andrew and Chris and Andrew. There was a lot I did not know about Whatcom County and broadband and how we get to where we want to go and the restrictions of getting there. And I was wondering if that could be more shown to us in the public so they understand why did we pick these yellow or purple or pink or whatever you want to call those areas, and why did we just blanket the whole county? From what I understand is we can't. And I don't know, a lot of people I think are showing frustration, thinking like, why aren't you at my house now? I live over in this area, and there's reasons why we are where we are and why we can't go where we want to go in cases. And also the last mile, how do we get to the last mile? Because it seems like we're the data, I'm sorry, I don't know all the language you guys know, but the data that when it comes in, how do we get from there to the last mile? Because it seems like we're skipping a spot, the backbone, we're skipping over to the last mile. And I don't understand that either. So am I making any sense to any of you, Andrew or Chris? Andrew, you were there, you heard all my questions, so you probably know what I'm talking about.
So let me take a pass at this just for a second, and then Andrew, I'm going to kick it over to you because on the technical side, Andrew's really the expert. But so starting with the first question first, and that's how do we let the public know? The Broadband Steering Committee that's comprised of PUD and port people has proposed to have, I think in the third week of April, a public hearing that's just on broadband. And I would imagine that what we would do in there was we would daylight the methodology that Andrew's come up with to identify the target areas and how that matches up with the grant funding that's available. So it's one of those things where I think we can get a lot of information out to the public. Whether or not the public kind of avails themselves of it, that's a different issue. But we'll have the meeting. We'll have it on Zoom. It'll be YouTubed, and we can always point people back at it if they have questions. And that may be the easiest way to answer the question is, there was a public hearing on this that addressed all that. Go to this website and you can watch the YouTube, or go to this minute of the YouTube and it'll tell you, it answers the question you're bringing up. So the second part of your question really dealt with how we went from middle mile to final mile. And at the highest level, the answer is that that's what the grants were funding. They really weren't funding backbone type applications. So what you end up doing is building a little bit of middle mile, but mainly final mile infrastructure. And then that's there and available for high-speed internet when you're connected to the current providers, in this case, Pogo Zone. So you're kind of limited by whatever they have for the backhaul beyond where we pick up. As they upgrade their system over time, which will happen, the speeds that the downstream customers will see will go up and up and up. So Andrew, at this point, I'll kick it over to you.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that was a great overview of the lay of the land today, and I don't have anything else to add.
So it's curious because the council's got a lot on its plate, and sometimes it doesn't realize its own participation in outcomes that come back to it. So one of those aspects is the certainly the federal and state funding are very focused on fiber to the premise, but our county council didn't do anything in terms of its input in the EDI process to discourage that or emphasize backbone either. So our recently outgoing council member Rod Brown made it a point of only wanting to support fiber to the premise activities. So that's part of the answer to that county council, because that's what you asked for is part of the answer there. In addition to that, I don't think that as a group we are in any way abandoning the original desire to address backbone. It's just the approach will be more circuitous. There's potential that these patches that Andrew presented on the map could become a ring. So, and if that happens, then we get to both serve lots of nearly unserved. I'm every PUD meeting, I get to make up a new term. I feel like when I'm talking about the level of service that people receive, so I'll keep that up. And since nobody's putting, maybe I need to make my own glossary on the terms. And I think we're all using terms like this a little bit casually, but whatever you want to call it, people in pain, data pain. We're doing a lot to improve that situation, but there's also, I think, quite a consistent hope among all of us that out of that will create an opportunity to create a ring and backhaul services and all of that will support us. Maybe not tomorrow, but at some point in the future. And in that regard, I wanted to share and mention that I've done quite a bit of outreach and identified several neighborhoods. I went in depth with Andrew and talked about 4 different neighborhoods. And I feel like I made a dent in 1 out of those 4, and because it really fit in with the maps. The one out in Van Zant is unfortunately being covered by an RDOF project. But I'm trying to schedule an educational meeting out there to explain what their actual situation is and obviously empower them to work with their proposed or claiming to be telecom provider. Obviously we have access to data. And one of the things that we may want to consider, and I want to bring up now, is that where we don't actually lead the charge with the port, that is for actual infrastructure development, I'm wondering to the degree where we can provide services for other people, community groups, to do things like LUDs, because they may not be eligible for federal and state funding, but they may still have the motivation to roll up their sleeves, maybe even dig their own trenches in their own neighborhood. Well, there's many things that the PUD could do to support that activity, including defining best practices for them, maintaining the maps for them, meaning when the 811 number is called, that we would be designated as their resource so that they, there's many things we could do to support communities taking action. And it's something that as we move forward now, as we're figuring out more and more of what we're not going to be doing in the near term, yet we have these groups of very motivated community members who want to do something. I'd like us to figure out how we can support them. I don't exactly have a clear vision of that. Right now I'm just talking to them, but as in the case of Van Zant and the project on Smith Road and the project off of Y Road. So I'm hopeful that we can figure out a way to materially make their lives easier by way of our knowledge base, some kind of consulting support. But that's something that we have to figure out. And if we can't, I also want to let them know we can't help you, and then help them figure out other people that can. So their community involvement is a real resource, and so I want people to not feel frustrated with government. I want them to feel supported. So that's important to me. So and there's some neighborhoods potentials that are north of Custer that are really attractive areas to kind of close a gap in that map that I'm very interested in exploring it.
Responses, Chris or Andrew?
Well, I would just say that in the way you characterized it, Commissioner Deshmani, is correct. And that is, we don't know exactly how we can help yet. Probably the best thing for us to do would be for you to get Andrew and I in contact with that group. And then we could bring a proposal back to the commission and say, here's what they want. Here's what we think we can do. And I will just caution you on 811, if we become their 811 provider, then we end up with responsibility if it's mismarked. So, there's yes, it's a great service to provide for a small community group. However, there's a huge liability that goes with it, and just be aware.
And I'll just add, Commissioner Deshmani did send me over the group's plans, which are very well put together and thought through. So thank you. And Chris and I will be reviewing those too.
Yeah, 2 out of those 3 are very well put. The third one is very much in the absolute. We want help. We want to do something, and we want the PUD to help us figure out what to do. So right now, and even when it's happened, I think the key point is to figure out if at all possible to improve or facilitate the kind of support that from the private sector telecoms that are supposed to be serving them. And then only when that doesn't produce fruit to try to help them find their own solution. But yeah,
Well,
as we know, as a PUD, this PUD and many people in public utilities know that just the presence of public utility attention is a very valuable asset for community members. And that's why I think we should provide that attention.
Chris, I really, I think that you and Andrew coming back to the commission with kind of a some analysis of how we might be able to support these groups, it would be really valuable for me. And would be a way that we could support the community, and like Commissioner Deshmani said, in a way that we would not be stepping on the port's toes. So that would be wonderful from my perspective. Commissioner Murphy, anything to add on that topic?
Thank you, Christine. Not really, except that my time with Andrew, I want to spend more time with him because he has a lot of knowledge. But what he showed me made it real clear why we are going in the direction we're going, what we can and can't do. And I think the public should know as much as they can. And I think he has the presentation in his slides that he showed me to really say, here's where we're going, why we're going there. Because I learned a lot from that moment with him, that time. And I just don't think the public has that knowledge either. So I was just sharing that.
Agree. I think communication on this has been really difficult. I think the press release helped, but it didn't go into details. And I think that sharing the YouTube videos of our meetings is helpful. But you know, I do think we really need to keep on working on, I mean, even Andrew, if you could do just I mean, in partnership with the port, I do think we need to figure out, even if it's just a 7-minute explainer video where you put the map up there and you say, here are the grants we got, here's where we're going, we're going to provide gigabit fiber service, it's an open access model, you know, and kind of walk people through it. And then it's just a 7-minute explainer or a summary. But, you know, I think that would make that would be great for everyone to have that. So maybe something you could talk to Gina and others at the port about.
Absolutely.
One other topic while we're on broadband is just that I know we have a lot of work to do implementing the projects that we have, but then in the WPUDA meetings, hearing about all the grants that are coming up, the state broadband office, new grant funding opens in April. And so I know I haven't heard anything about that, what our plans as a community are to apply for that. So I just want to make sure that as Chris and Andrew, as the two of you are collaborating with the port, that we're really thinking through how we're managing our staffing resources so that we can keep applying for those grants. So there's kind of a steady stream of funding coming in, because I don't want people to think that getting to these 2,200 homes is where we're stopping. This is an ongoing process of applying for grants and seeking to expand the infrastructure. We just can't do it all in one fell swoop. We have to keep bringing in the money to do it.
Christine, what about the county with the money they've received? Shouldn't we be going after some of that money? Maybe
Yes.
even do the backbone?
Absolutely. And we talked about that in our broadband steering committee meeting. And Andrew, you can jump in here, but I believe that the plan was that the county council wasn't planning to make decisions about the pot of ARPA funding or American Rescue dollars that could potentially fund the backbone. And so the group was going to plan on coming up with a better plan for what exactly we were going to ask of the county council for funding additional infrastructure. Andrew, did I get all that right?
Yep, that's correct. Yep. And just evaluate it, and maybe we don't, and maybe we can dedicate more of those dollars to end user connections, but we'll just model it out and come to them in April or May, whenever that time slot is for us to make our presentation. We'll be prepared.
But I think it's great to continue having these conversations like you were talking about, Commissioner Deshmani, with different members of the county council to get them educated and excited about broadband. And, you know, Andrew and I did a quick call with Sat Paul to County Executive Sidhu to so that Andrew could meet him and just really begin forming that relationship. But you know, this is new for everyone in our county, and we haven't done it before, so we're all learning together, and we have to bring everyone along, and it's going to take some time, but I think we'll get there.
When did the press release come out, and is it can someone send that to me? Is that already out somewhere on our website or on the board?
Chris or Andrew, can we forward that to commissioners and then also post it on our website? Would that be possible, Chris?
Yeah, it should be not a problem at all.
And I want to share it on social media too.
And the Cascadia Daily did an article about it already too.
Oh, great.
If you want to search for that. And then the last thing too, is it sounds like Council Member Kaylee Galloway might be joining some of the broadband steering committee meetings, not as, you know, chair or anything, but just to learn and be engaged. So that's great too, that we're getting another council member involved in broadband.
Nothing there. We haven't had another meeting of the city's advisory group, but I am wanting to, we have one private sector ISP that's collaborating with the public sector, and that is seems to be openly embracing the idea of open access. So I'm going to invite them, that's Pogozone, to come in and present at the city's BAG at our March meeting, which means they would probably be presenting in April, just as an FYI. Yeah, I expect that will be supported by the committee.
Any other questions or thoughts on broadband? Okay, well, let's move on to our next item on the agenda, Resolution 812. I believe that is you, Mr. Sitkin.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. So this comes back to the commission. We've had this in the agendas in January, and it was deferred for some further review. You'll recall this came up in December last year to review some concerns about personal attacks that were increasing in political communications locally, regionally, nationally. And there were some uses of intimidation, insulting speech, and to influence policy, it seems. So the commission asked, what could we do? And really, in the form of political speech, there isn't a lot you can do unless it becomes intimidating or intentionally intimidating through uses of threats, and then it's a crime, intimidating a public servant, which isn't in your realm to take action on other than to report to the prosecutor. So in looking at that, we said we could draft an aspirational policy that try to set a tone of what your expectation was for civil political discourse, to encourage civility. It's not something you can mandate behavior on part of the public or employees, but you can affirm that you don't want to see bullying or intimidation, harassing, hateful, threatening speech. And you can establish a process if you were concerned something went beyond the pale, if you will, of how you would approach that. And all of this in that process would be what you would do in the normal course in any event. You would refer it to the general manager in my office, and we would review it to see if there's things that could happen, either by referring to a prosecutor or some kind of restraining order or injunctive relief. So this is truly aspirational. It is not regulatory. It seeks to set a standard or goal for communication to elevate civil discourse, but it does not limit free speech nor establish an employee requirement. In redrafting this and developing a draft and outline and earlier drafts, we went through, it's interesting, there's, this US House of Representatives passed a resolution on civil discourse, seeing the need. There is a National Institute on Civil Discourse. You have groups, the golden rule.org or something like that, which really, this is kind of the golden rule of how you engage with empathy and humility and try to engage in civility. So we pulled a lot of different things and trying to pull this together. But again, it's aspirational and it's offered for your consideration at your request.
So I have no further comments on it. Yeah, I very much agree with you, John, that there's really nothing we can do to communicate to the public how they should behave. What we can do is lead by example, and that's what this document is doing from my perspective, identifying how we intend to lead by example, and not like the PUD has not led by example on this subject. Even recently, we've had the opportunity to demonstrate how we respond to attacks. And so we'll just continue to do that. Now, there is something that this policy doesn't address that I look forward to addressing this year. And that is that whenever you get kind of negative toned input, it's always a reminder to me that not that I'm getting too much input, is that I'm not getting enough input. And there's a lot of people who have a lot to contribute to our policy decisions, but they choose not to participate because either they have confidence in the process that's already happening, or they're too busy. And one of the things we should continually be thinking of, how do we lower the barriers to entry for input from, let's say, the civilly inclined and thoughtful residents of our community. So that is something that we really should be addressing in our social media strategy. And I look forward to really replacing maybe a situation where, and I think this is something that we can lead on, maybe set some practices that are best in class in our local government, and that can point the way for other local governments who are struggling with much, I would say, more acute issues of at times outrage from the community, and how to engage the community more effectively, and rather than leaving it to the people that are the most frustrated. And not to say that the people that are frustrated don't matter either. It's just getting a balanced set of inputs so that we get a chance to put it all in context.
I just add, commissioners, I appreciate that leadership role, and this policy here may be the first step in that. I couldn't find anything regionally that had anything similar on the civil discourse. So in that sense, you are trying to lead, as you say, the next step through social media, but here is trying to lead and change or set an expectation of how we conduct civil discourse. I thought I would be remiss if I didn't add some of the considerations that in December, January, rather, that led to this is, you have an increasing number of guns and willingness to use or threaten with violence, increasing hate crimes in our society, it seems. I mean, today was the guilty verdicts of the murders of Aubrey in Georgia, and those were hate crimes. So the propensity in the January 6th attacks, the Capitol, propensity for increased violence is occurring in our society. And so this seemed to be a step that the commission had pursued to try to change the tone or try to lead, as you said, Commissioner Deshmani, in changing some of the tone of our discourse.
I did actually want to say, I learned from my calls with the county council that they actually have a similar resolution on their agenda today, which was introduced by the 3 women on the county council, Kathy Kirshner, Carol Frazee, and Kaylee Galloway. And they're calling theirs a respectful workplace standard. And it's a little bit different, but they're aware of ours now, and we'll be voting on theirs today as well.
Great.
So commissioners, I have nothing else unless there's any questions. It's time for a motion, consideration of a motion.
So I'll make that motion to approve resolution number 812 on the public discourse policy.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 The motion carries. The next item on our agenda, thank you, John, by the way. The next item on our agenda is to approve amendment number 2 for our regional water supply grant. And I see Rebecca on the screen. Is this you, Rebecca?
Yes, good morning, Commissioners. I'm
Welcome.
going to carry this and Steve can jump in if he would like to. This is a second amendment to the regional water supply grant we have with WDW. Just quickly backgrounding this for some of the newer members. The district has been a longtime member of the Watershed Management Board, and which includes us, the city, all the small cities, city of Bellingham, Whatcom County government, the Lummi Nation tribe, and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we also have ex officio member of the Ag Water Board who do not vote. But we work closely with the Watershed Management Board through the strategic plan that is created by them, the 5-year strategic plan. And one of the strategies is a regional water supply plan. We received funding back in or notification of funding back in 2019 for $100,000 through the Puget Sound Partnership National Estuary Program. We were able to also apply for the money for 2020. So we ended up with an amendment number 1 for the additional $100,000. So at that point we had $200,000. We worked on phase 1 of the scope of work and completed that in February of 2021. Took a little longer than we anticipated. There was a lot of data that was collected. It was, I should say, data analyzed. We didn't go out and actually find new data. We just took the data that was already existing. At that point, we had 3 pilot subbasins that we did, and that was concluded. And then we started in on phase 2. We decided to hire RH2, or the Regional Water Supply Working Group, decided that we would reach out to RH2 for the second phase because they have so much good background in water issues in the basin. So they were contracted and started working on phase 2. At that point, we all realized that we probably needed to extend the time through to December of this year. And we wanted to get, we originally asked for $47,000 additional funding through this National Estuary Program. They came back with $28,000. So we are here today for this amendment 2 to ask the commission to approve the addition of the $28,000. So the total grant would not exceed $228,000. And we would also extend the term to December 15th of 2022. And I kind of went through that quickly, but I can answer questions or if you want a little more detail on anything. Atul?
So I have questions about what technical questions will this help us answer this work?
Well, it's going to help us answer. We're looking at habitat issues, in-stream flow issues, water supply issues, and out of that should come a plan. And it won't be as comprehensive because we can't do the entire basin with this funding amount. We are going to do 12 of 18 subbasins. Those 12 subbasins were chosen by the working group and prioritized. So we've had 3 that we did in the first phase, and now we're doing 9 more with this funding we have left. We had hoped to get enough funding to do all 18, but that's not going to happen. So this phasing is going to allow us to look at where the water is. I mean, not that we don't already know that, but more comprehensively, and how we can use the information that we know, which is now being completed, put into a database that will be accessible for agencies to understand and use that information to better answer questions about water supply, in-stream flows, fish habitat, etc. And I can certainly make available the technical support, or the technical phase 1 report, if you want to read that from the first phase. And that this phase 2 will build on that.
The phase 1 is basically defining the 3 areas.
Yes. And we will take the same methodologies that we used in phase 1 and apply them to the phase 2, 9 additional subbasins.
So I remember looking at an early version before the phase 1 report was completed.
Mhm.
But now that it's, and I did provide very limited input in that very early stage. But I would like to see the complete report, because I didn't make the time to look at the kind of, I think the second to final version.
Mhm.
I would like to make the time to look at that report.
For the phase 1?
Yeah.
Sure.
And just for the benefit of the public, I just want to tell you how I currently understand this process. What we're doing here is not so much generating or taking brand new measurements.
Correct.
What we're doing here is recognizing that going from actual data in the field to policy is a multi-step process.
Correct.
And something that's sometimes folks in the public may find confusing is how much time it takes to go from facts in the field to policy. And there's a process of community digestion. When I say community, I'm referring to a variety of natural resources staff and local governments, including the tribes, and to essentially bless the data and its implications.
Correct.
And that's how we get the policy without having, so otherwise what can happen, and does happen, is if Rebecca looks at the data, for example, and I apologize for using this example, please correct me, by the way, if I'm missing the mark here in what I'm about to say. But if Rebecca unilaterally decides, here's the data and here's what it means, here's what we need to do. Well, what are people in other local governments going to say? Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I wasn't involved in the process. So this is why we go through all of these steps, because we want the outcomes to be built on a solid foundation of data, shared review of that data, acceptance of the data, and then through each successive stage of conclusion from that data to the point where we actually get to policy. Now, please fix what I said, Rebecca.
No, I mean, you're correct. I mean, I would just reiterate that the district is doing this on behalf of the Watershed Management Board, which we have been a membership with them since 1999, 2000. There were 2 individual boards. One was the Watershed Planning Board. It was called the Joint Board. And one was the Salmon Recovery Board. They were both created about approximately the same time in the early 2000s. We have now since joined together and are one board working all together on salmon recovery issues. I mean, if you'd like me to briefly go through what the strategies are from that 5-year plan from the Watershed Management Board, this is one of the strategies that they are trying to do to follow and continue to follow the original Watershed Management Plan that was approved in 2004. And yes, it takes a long time because we're working collaboratively with, like I said, the tribes, all of the county agencies, the small cities, and it takes a while. And collecting the data and reviewing the data and hiring consultants. I mean, it's a long, slow process. There's many people who, I've heard, particularly in the planning unit, say, well, why you haven't gotten anything done? Well, if you look at the data that we compiled from all the past years that we're using to inform this regional water supply plan, there has been a lot of work done and a lot of money spent. No denying that. A lot of it grant money, a lot of it federal funds. But that's why we continue to work with the Watershed Management Board, and the PUD has stepped up several times to apply for grants and have been successful in receiving those grants. So we just continue to help support any resolutions we can on water supply issues in this basin. And you're right, it has to go up to the policy level, but the
Yeah.
technical work has to be done first.
And I just wanted to thank you for all these years of effort in this regard, because it's better to be proactive than to have to de-escalate a conflict over how we see the data. So.
And stay tuned, we are planning to have a water workshop, brief water workshop, I believe the last meeting in March. So you will hear a little bit more of this in detail on the history of the whole watershed planning effort and the PUD's part of that. And I'm done. So I would appreciate it. We would like to have the commission approve the additional $28,000 funding, which would make our grant total $228,000 and extend the term to December 15th, 2022.
I'll make that motion to do so.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any further discussion? I actually did have, I'm gonna jump in under further
Sure.
discussion. So will we get the policy, some policy recommendations from you, Rebecca, and others? I mean, it looks like the final report is, you're aiming for December 5th. Is that when we might hear from you about policy recommendations?
Well, we could, I'm not sure that there will be specific policy recommendations, but we can certainly, we will have those draft reports out for review and we can certainly make them available to the commission.
Okay.
And that would be well before December 5th. I mean, that would be sometime in November. Yes.
Okay. I think that would be great. And I would love to hear from you again in the presentation format, just to kind of walk us through the recommendations.
One of the requirements of the scope of work, let me just double check, is I believe we have to do a presentation, actual, presentation to, this is a requirement of the grant. The WDFW asked us to do this as a final presentation. We'll invite, the commission will invite other people. Well, I don't know, we haven't got the list yet, but it will include members of the WDFW and anybody that's working at, because they manage the grant on their side. So there will be a final presentation, public presentation.
Great.
That we can invite the commission to see the outcome. Okay. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that last question. There is a motion and a second on the table. Is there any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 The motion carries.
Thank you, commissioners.
Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Okay, next item on the agenda, we're moving to new business and the approval of resolution 815.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. This is just a warrant that was issued to Pacific Underwriters, who is our agent, but the bond payments actually needed to go to CNA Surety. And so I processed a revolver check to get that check over to CNA, and I'm just canceling the one to Pacific Underwriters. They sent it back.
Okay, great. Any questions from my fellow commissioners?
No, I'm just hoping that increases security at firms for my next meeting.
Tracy,
Yes.
the letter I have says resolution 816, but it should be resolution 815.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's my mistake. It should be 816.
816.
Thanks, Ann.
I will make a motion that we approve resolution 816 cancellation.
I'll second it.
There's a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 The motion carries. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to approval of work order number 1-22 with Eagle Eye Aerial Solutions. That looks like it's you, Brian.
That's correct, Commissioner. At your last commission meeting on February 8th, you approved a professional services agreement with Eagle Eye Aerial Services. This is just a follow-on. This is the first work order under that new professional services agreement. And the scope under that work order will be for Eagle Eye to do aerial inspections of all 3 of the district substations, all of our transmission structures, 102 structures in total, and the intervening conductor spans between the structures. So they'll be looking at on the structures themselves, the cross arms, the turnbuckles, the insulators, the guy wires, close-in inspections. And then as the deliverables from their effort will be, they'll turn over to us all their photos, any videos they've taken. And then for each structure and conductor, they do a condition report. They have a checklist they go through. If we identify areas where there are problems, we'll go back and do a closer inspection. So it's a chance, we consider this a valuable O&M exercise that we do every year, and at a far less expense than if we were to use ground crews to accomplish the same work. And I think with that, I'll stop there, see if there's any questions.
I'm wondering to what extent these, now that we have a standardized observer in terms of a drone, to what extent are we now establishing industry-wide best practices for the use of those standardized observers? And then both in the process of inspection, but being able to compare what we see visually with what other utilities are seeing visually, and building some kind of a database of knowledge about how to classify different kinds of images as it relates to potential issues. Is that happening yet?
Great question, Commissioner. We have not made any attempt at this point to compare what information we're collecting and analyzing to what other utilities are doing. I think we were one of the first in the area that started using the aerial inspections with a drone. Since then, I know NWPPA has had that as a topic.
How about
There's a number-
PSC? Is PSC using these same drone technologies for inspecting their infrastructure?
I do not know. I know a number of the publics are, and it has been a topic within the NWPPA community. Whether or not there's been specific standards or protocols developed as a result of that, I can't answer at this time. I'd sure look into it for you if you'd like.
Well, yeah, as a neighbor and as a partner and a connection partner, I would be very interested to know what PSC is doing and what their best practices are, and see if there's things we can learn from each other, have opportunities for communication on things that we might see that relate to what PSC would see as well.
That might be a question. I see that there's Jack Wellman from PSC is on this Zoom conference today. So if he's willing to make a comment on that, that'd be great. But the other thing I'll note is for the refinery substation, there was reluctance on the part of the Phillips 66 refinery to allow a drone on site initially, both for security and safety. And they've since become comfortable with what we're doing out there. And I believe they have used similar services to inspect some of their equipment on site. So very valuable too.
So Jack or anybody from PSC, if you don't want to raise your hand and comment now, but if you could get back to our staff on that subject, and maybe we could establish the right point of contact, that'd be great. I'm just thinking it'd be good for us to learn from each other on the subject.
Commissioner,
Great.
I see Jack Willman has his hand up.
Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, thank you. I would be happy to follow up and get in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mhm.
Thanks, Jack. Great. Any other questions or discussion on this work order from my fellow commissioners?
I'd like to make a motion then to approve the work order 01-02-22 with Eagle Eye Aerial Solutions.
Oh, you're muted, Mike.
Second, thank you.
There's a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
The
Thank you,
motion
Commissioner.
carried. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Okay, the next item under new business is a discussion on moving to action notes. Is this you, Chris?
Yes, it is, Commissioner. So when we look at the meeting notes that are produced, there's something in between summary and transcript. And it seems to me that if we're going to, really to do a service to our staff and to our community, what we ought to do is have summary or action notes. And then if somebody wants something specific, the meeting itself is recorded. There's not even any need for transcript. Just go to the YouTube at such and such a location. So what I would propose to do is go to summary notes, and what they would do would essentially follow the agenda, and that this was what was talked about, and give the time for that the item was talked about on the YouTube, so you could just go there and refer directly to it. That saves kind of the agony of Ann having to semi-transcribe stuff, you guys having to review it in detail, when in fact the record is there. All you have to do is go and look at it. So I would propose that the three of you would look at just accepting summary notes, action notes, as Christine puts it, and that we would begin producing those with the results of this meeting for the next meeting and beyond.
Any discussion, commissioners?
Yeah, I mean, if I guess I just want to make sure that if Ann is comfortable with that, and I just also want to, well, I guess what I wanted to say is that I'm very appreciative of all the work Ann has done over the years, and during the minutes, and I really appreciate that. For me, it was very helpful when I decided to run to climb the learning curve on what the PUD is doing and what the PUD is about. And, one of the advantages of, just speaking for myself, of my process of research and what the PUD was doing was Word documents can be compiled and can be searchable. It makes it easy to figure out when the PUD talked about this issue or that issue. For example, something I was interested in was climate. And I did a search in all the Word documents to see if climate was discussed at the PUD and how it was discussed. So that was really helpful to me. But, I was a very special case customer for all that work. So I in no way want to increase the workload. And this is where many local governments are at now. And now that we're doing videos, Chris, when are we planning to continue to maintain video record then of going forward? Let's say we go back to in-person meetings. Are we going to keep video records then?
But one of the In fact, the first topic that I wanted to talk about in the general manager's report was just that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. So I'm supportive of it. I just wanted to share how I benefited from it. Really, is what I
Well,
want to
and
say.
like you, Commissioner, when I was going through the interview process, I went through and looked at commission meeting notes and found them incredibly valuable. One thing, Ann, thank you very much. So one thing to think about is you can still go and search the actual agendas, and we'll post the minute meetings, and they'll look just like the agenda. So it'll say, if you want to search for broadband, it'll bring up all of the agendas, and it'll also tell you exactly what time on the YouTube to go look at for the detail.
Which is actually even better. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this ends up, it really gets a lot more accurate, and it saves us from having to have Ann turn the thing into a transcript, which is really the next step. And we didn't want to go there. So this is more of, okay, here are the topics we hit. Here's when we hit them in the meetings, and that's what gets published.
Well, Chris, I'm about to ask you something, but I recognize the fact that I'm recognizing that very much wanting to factor in what's realistic. So one of the things, if these new minutes are a screening tool, then keywords might be helpful.
So
that
I
way,
think, we're going to have this time will be the first shot at it. And I expect that there'll be a lot of learning on this. And if it ends up not being the ideal solution, we can always change it.
Commissioner Murphy, did you have a question or a comment?
No, after listening to everyone, I mean, I understand why and understand it's probably the right direction to go. So I support it.
And Chris, when you were at Snohomish PUD and just, I've looked at kind of how other commissions conduct themselves, but would you say the summary notes or action notes are pretty common with other PUDs?
Certainly, it's more what I've seen. Now, I will tell you that where you see them is where there's either a audio recording or an audio visual recording of the meeting. And then they'll have a summary note and they direct you to the recording. That's the way Snohomish did it. They would typically have 4 or 5 hour meetings and then produce about a page of notes. And basically, if you wanted anything in addition to that, you just were directed to the audio recording for that particular session. In Henderson, we operated the same way. It was an audio recording. We had summary notes, and it's consistent with what I've seen.
Okay, great. So there is not a recommended action here, but it sounds like, John, do we need to make a formal motion here, or is this discussion enough to give the general manager direction?
I think you just have direction. While you were speaking, I checked the governance and management. You don't have a prescribed format of the minutes in your policy. So I think staff can bring back a different form of the minutes, and you can reject or accept that. So I think you can just proceed in course. I just thought I'd add, for whatever it's worth, there is a pending legislation that would provide encouragement for agencies to provide audio or video recording that's making it through. It's Senate Executive Committee today, executive session. It's made it through House Rules. Last week, it made it all the way through House yet last year. So this bill has been brought back. Don't know what'll happen, but it's likely, and you'll see increased encouragement, if not regulation, on requiring audio visual recording.
Thank you. Is everyone okay moving on to the general manager's report? Okay, Chris, take it away.
So the first thing is, and I've talked to Commissioner Grant about this, but not Commissioner Deshmani or Commissioner Murphy. We're going to go back to having the ability to have in-person meetings at some time in the relatively near future. Looks like end of March. Yeah. So my recommendation is that we proceed with hybrid meetings where you can attend in person if you want, or we will continue to have Zoom and record it on YouTube meetings. There's times when the commissioners may find it difficult to get there in person. There are people who would wish to talk to us and present it. Some will want to do it in person. Many will want to continue doing it on Zoom. So my recommendation is that as we proceed to open up the meetings to have in-person attendance, that we also maintain the ability to have Zoom attendance and really begin conducting hybrid meetings as our standard format going forward. So at this point, I'm not asking for any guidance or, I mean, I can get all kinds of input from you guys, but we don't have the governor's input yet on going back. So, you know, this is a discussion for you guys to be thinking about, you know, and now what questions do you have? What do you think we ought to do?
Yeah, I'm open to that for sure. So.
Commissioner Murphy.
Chris, well, thank you. Chris, going back to our public meetings, does that mean we're still going to have some guidelines? Because I hear there may still be some guidelines. We may have our public meetings, but there may still be some guidelines of how many people in a room or how far we have to sit. Are you hearing that too, or are you aware of that?
I'm aware of that. I haven't seen the final guidelines yet from the governor's office. I'm not sure if they're out. So, and the answer to the question is yes, we'll adhere to, you know, the guidance that we get from the governor's office, any rules and regulations around open meetings, you know, all of that. But what I expect will happen is, if, for instance, they're going to open up the Kraken games to attendance without masks. So you're going to have, you know, 10,000 people screaming at the top of their lungs, sitting next to each other. And, you know, it's kind of hard pressed to say, well, you can't have an open meeting in that kind of environment. So I suspect we'll get some guidance. It may be, you know, 3-foot spacing or masks optional, and whatever that guidance is, be happy to adhere to it. I do suspect though that, you know, if we do a hybrid type meeting, that in a typical meeting, we would have the folks that you see on the meeting here today, a few would be in person and the rest would be on Zoom. And this would largely be the kind of audience that we would typically draw.
Well, I think go ahead, Commissioner Murphy. Yeah.
Thank you. The reason I said that, Chris, because if we have to have some form of regulations, I couldn't see why staff couldn't stay in their offices and we leave as much room as we can if we're restricted to that public area being to serve the public, and not fill it with staff as we have in the past. And it probably would benefit staff too, not to sit in our meetings in the boardroom. So I would like to recommend we leave that boardroom area for the public, those who want to attend.
And I think staff, you know, any of them that want to can ring in, but that's kind of consistent with what I've heard from staff. And also it's consistent with what I've observed in other utilities that have hybrid and open meetings.
Thank you.
I wanted to share also that the PUD's office is difficult to get to if you own a car, for example, or you know, there's also just the travel time associated with coming to a meeting, and maybe you want to listen to part of it, but not the whole thing. So I do think a hybrid option also gives the community more options to participate, which per our previous conversation is something I think we all value. So looking forward to, I mean, many agencies are working through the details of how to move to this hybrid world. And Chris, I know you and the team will figure it out, and we look forward to hearing more about the mechanics of it.
All right, so I will bring something back next time that we can talk about. Hopefully I'll have the governor's guidelines in hand and I can say this is kind of what that looks like.
Great.
So the second thing is I've been working with Jim on the strategic plan, had a couple of conversations with him, a couple with Steve as well. And we're at the point now where on the initiatives, we're going to be taking it back to you guys. So it's going to be your turn. So Ann will be reaching out to you to schedule some time to sit down with Jim and take a look at, you know, relook at the initiatives, look at the proposed measures on the initiatives, you know, think about how you want that configured or changed. And then, you know, also be thinking about the scope of work we're executing on. Jim will be getting back to us to do a complete refresh on the strategic plan. And we're looking to do that fairly quickly. I think it's important to have that foundation in place.
Great.
Mike?
Chris, if we're going to meet one-on-one with Jim, I don't see the advantage of it for me, without having commissioners with, I'd like to be in a workshop atmosphere because hearing the other commissioners, as well as them hearing me, and we bounce off each other with ideas, I think is more beneficial than Jim just saying, Mike, what do you want? And then he has to say that 2 other times. So I'd rather have a workshop together.
We can certainly do that. Scheduling gets a little more difficult. We have to have, because that would establish a quorum. So we'll have to notice the meeting, and it's going to have to be public unless we take it into executive session. So those are some things to think about. With Jim contacting each of you, no cross communication between you. We're not establishing a quorum or anything like that. So our thought was to have each of you have a chance to look at this and give us direct feedback before we get you together as a group. If you want to skip that intermediate step, we can do that.
I'm only one of 3, so I'd have to turn to the others 2 to, I mean, if you want to meet one-on-one, Christine, I support that. I'll meet with Jim. I'm not saying I wouldn't, but I think for our strategic planning for the future, I really need to hear where the 3 of us, as well as from the staff, where we're heading. I think it's time to rewrite the strategic planning.
Well, what I'm talking about is just the update on the initiatives. So we're talking short term, what are the initiatives that kind of spell out what we want to do for the rest of this year? And then that, what I would expect is that we get some one-on-one input from each of you and then bring you together and have, a work session on that as part of one of our regular meetings. The strategic planning itself is going to be a whole separate initiative. And we intend to start that right after we close the initiatives for the initiative update for this year. And then that'll be, yes, we'll have workshops, we'll have public hearings. We're going to go through the whole enchilada there.
Got it. So to Commissioner Murphy, I think that because it's a present year task, so I think I'm comfortable having one-on-one meetings, but I'm also looking forward to the meeting where we're all together and discussing the new initiatives, where we adopt the new initiatives, which we can do in a regular meeting, and we could do a special meeting too. But the point is that would be a group conversation. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that the one-on-one conversations for the initiatives, those are not meant to be, very in-depth, drawn out, strategic look at the next 20 years. It's really, here are the initiatives that you guys approved prior. And here's how they look today. And here are some proposed measures for success on those. And really getting your feedback on that. And then getting the 3 of you together on the initiatives. And after we get that kind of nailed down, then we move forward with a strategic plan. But I want to do all this pretty quickly.
And that third column, that measure of success, is not really something we populated. And that's really important to do. And so that will be an important next. I'm glad we're doing that. So because the main purpose of the initiatives was the support the recruitment process. And now that we got you, now we got to get you to fill in that third column for us.
Right.
Just to weigh in, I think I would prefer to have the conversations with Jim, have him kind of help us organize our thoughts a little bit, and then have a meeting where we're able to have some conversations together. But I thought that the way that he did it last year was really helpful. And I think it made us a little bit more efficient in our meeting time. Because we'd already done some processing and some thinking out loud with Jim beforehand. John?
I just want to underscore a comment Chris made, is that the individual meetings with Jim are not to share information amongst the commissioners' comments. So they are for individual commissioners to consider your own thoughts, and to avoid a serial meeting. And Chris underscored that. I just wanted to re-underscore that so we're clear that Commissioner Deshmani isn't going to hear from Jim what Commissioner Murphy had thought or Grant. It's just going to be to help Commissioner Deshmani, and I used him as a pigeon here, and I apologize, but that was just using it as an example.
Thanks, John.
Right, got it. I won't make a joke about it.
Wasn't directed at any one commissioner.
I'll
Sorry.
just laugh and not make a joke about it. Great.
So we'll be hearing from Jim soon.
Yes, Ann will reach out to you, schedule Zoom meetings, and then we'll bring, as soon as we get that information back together and get it collated, we'll bring it back in one of our regular commission meetings and have a broader discussion. And that's where you got each other's.
Yeah. One other thing and how this relates to hybrid meetings is that I also think having hybrid meetings going forward indefinitely makes sense, because sometimes our consultants are not in Whatcom County, like Jim, for example, and it makes it more affordable when they're able to join us virtually. So anyways, just wanted to share that thought. And Chris, thank you. I look forward to talking to Jim, and please continue on your general manager report.
So part of what I've done the last couple of weeks is meet a few of our customers, not all of them, but last week I had the opportunity to go out to Phillips 66, and I see Lauren Turner is on the call, and I just wanted to extend my thanks to Lauren and all the folks out at 66. I've been around refineries my whole career. I've never been inside the fence, and it was about an hour and a half tour once we got through, kind of the orientation part of it, and I learned a heck of a lot. It's amazing what goes on inside that facility. I'm glad that we're part of supplying it with water and power, and it was really nice to see what one of our largest customers does. So Lauren, my thanks to you and all the folks out there. What I'd like to do now is shift gears and share my screen with everyone. Can everybody see this?
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
So why is that not working? Okay. So what I want to do is, when you guys interviewed me, I made some comments that, without backing it up in any way, and some of you guys picked up on that and asked me questions about it, but what I wanted to do was share with you a presentation that I'm going to make this afternoon at WWU. So this is how I look at the electric industry and kind of what I know about it. Much of what I've got in here is going to be personal opinion. I'll try and cite that. Some of what's in here is a forecast. And Commissioner Deshmani, what do we know about forecasts?
No, they're estimates. They're estimates based on our experience. Yeah.
That's right. And basically, I can tell you with certainty that every forecast that you've ever seen is wrong. The question is by how much and in what direction. And so when you see a forecast here, kind of recognize there's that uncertainty around it, that I may present it as if it's a fact, but it's not. It's an estimate that there's an error bar around, and it can be very large. The other thing is, some of the things I'm going to talk about in here are predictions. Now, predictions can be right. A Ouija board can be right. A broken clock is right twice a day. Predictions can be right, but they're really based on, when I make a prediction, it's based on my knowledge of the industry and having done this for 40 years and kind of seen it. So I always start out and I ask a simple question: do you want electricity from the audience? And the audience usually says, well, of course we do. And the answer is you don't. You really don't want it. What you want is warm water and cool air. You want your elevators to work. You want sounds and images out of your big screen, and you want light out of your light. That is not electricity. That is what electricity gets you. In fact, electricity itself, if you look at a wall plug, the reason that the wall plug is shaped the way it is to keep small fingers away from electricity. It's literally a safety device to keep humans, especially small humans, away from electricity. One of the reasons we put power lines on top of poles as a society is to get that air gap so that humans can't reach up and touch the wires. It's a very dangerous commodity in some regards, and it's got to be carefully managed. It's not something that you want. So just kind of as an overview, we have three systems that govern the electric industry. The first is the legal system. I'll talk a little bit about that. Second is the economic system. We'll talk a little more about that. And the third is the physics that cover the industry. And I'm not going to talk much about that at all. So the legal system is more than just the laws, but it certainly is the laws. But it's also all of the regulations. So you think about all of the regulatory bodies that come to bear on our industry. Think about the EPA.
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt, Chris. Are you wanting your slides to advance?
Yeah, are they not advancing?
They're not advancing.
They are on my screen. Huh.
Sorry.
Hey, Chris, you have the share screen backwards. We're seeing the actual PowerPoint and you're seeing the slideshow.
Okay, so let me start this again. Oh, this isn't working at all. Well, I think I have help on the way.
I was gonna say when Jim talks to us, I'd prefer if he puts some kind of a background at least, so it doesn't remind us that he's sitting in some place lovely and sunny.
Not
Maybe something on, if we could have some background, we could send him of the Mongolian steppe. You know, that would make me feel better. Other than a sunny day in Palm Springs.
Are you guys seeing the share screen now?
Yes, and you were just about to talk about the legal system.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate it. It's good to have great staff. So clearly you've got all the laws that underlie our system, but you've also got, when you think about regulations, think about the EPA. And right now they're putting incredible pressure on the electric industry through the groundwater laws. You've got all of the air laws for emissions. You've got all of the service required laws that are put forth by the PSC and other agencies. Something that most people don't think about is the governance. You know, in our industry, we've got governance that, you know, you've got a board of directors for an investor-owned utility. You've got obviously a board of commissioners for a publicly owned utility. And then you've got other types of governance for co-ops. So that makes a difference on how a utility is run and how it functions in our industry. And then last, every utility's got a web of contracts. And this goes everything from power and water supply to janitorial contracts. There's just an enormous number of actual contractual obligations between every utility and things outside of the utility. The economic system is pretty straightforward. And I'm going to try and move this over here. There we go. So this is the way that regulators have looked, and frankly, utilities have looked at the business from the very start. So the sigma just means summation or add up. So if you add up all the costs of generation, all the costs of transmission, all the costs of distribution, and then add a reasonable profit if you're investor owned, divide it by your sales, and that has to equal the rate you charge. And that literally is how utilities, now in a public, obviously profit is zero, but that's how utilities have set rates, and that's how regulators have set rates for the last 140 years, to the extent that regulators have been involved that long. And really, when you think about it, this, you know, where is the customer in all of this? And the answer is they aren't in this. You've got a regulator or a commission that decides what should be charged, and this is the formula that they use to figure it out. The physics are a little more complex. This is Maxwell's equations. So we know this physical model works, and what it means is that things on an electric system happen literally at the speed of light. This model works well as long as you're not going near the speed of light, and as long as you're not around steeply curved gravitational wells. Other than that, this model works brilliantly, and it's really what governs the actual functioning of the electrical systems. So today, what I want to talk about is how we got here. You know, where did the industry come from, how it developed, and the information age I kind of pick arbitrarily is about 1970. That's when you had a lot of penetration of computers into organizations. Where are we today, the current status, what future trends there are, and then where I think we're going to end up long term. So where we started was literally this fella. This is a picture that was cropped out of a very famous photograph that had Teddy Roosevelt, Harvey Firestone, Wrigley. There were 7 of them total, but this is Thomas Edison. Now, what Thomas Edison did could not be done today. He literally invented the light bulb, but he invented the power system. And this is a drawing of the first power station, which was in Manhattan. It was coal-fired. And actually, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but it could burn a lot of other things. And eventually it was driven out of Manhattan because of the smog that it created locally. But what Edison did was he created the power industry, and he created what became known as General Electric. Now, General Electric did a couple of things. It supplied all of the equipment to the power industry, and it supplied all of the appliances that people used to consume power. So he was, in a sense, a triple monopolist. He created the company that supplied both the supply and the demand, and then he created the demand and ran the whole thing. Now today, he would be kind of run out of town on a rail, but when asked why he did this, he said because he thought electrification of America would be a good thing. And I submit to you that, in fact, it was. So when you look at where this all started, power was generated 2 different ways. One was you dam a river. And typically where you've got higher elevation drop, this is called high head hydro. That's where it dropped, many feet over a short distance. And typically you looked at canyons and gorges or places where there were extreme rapids. And then the second way, and so you use the energy in the water to turn a shaft and generate electricity. The second way to do it was to burn stuff. And typically we burn stuff and it created steam, which then either used a reciprocation device or a turbine to spin a shaft and generate electricity. Now, we burned all kinds of stuff. I mean, you can find back in the 1880s and 1890s, wood, dung, whale oil, literally anything that would burn, coal, natural gas, manufactured gas. All this stuff was burned. And some of it turned out to be cost effective, some of it didn't. One thing that we found, though, was that the bigger the generator, the more efficient it was. And that was from a lot of different perspectives. And so these led to a couple of things. First of all, you didn't typically have a city built on a canyon. There's some exceptions, but not many. So the dams aren't near where the power was used, only that's where you happen to generate it. And the second thing was people didn't want you burning stuff in their backyard for kind of obvious reasons. So this forced generators to be distant from customers. The power was made somewhere other than where it was consumed. And the electricity had to be produced the instant it was consumed and consumed the instant it was produced. There wasn't any good way to store it. So that forced the generators to track the loads. Now, what this looked like originally, you would have a small company set up. So there'd be an entrepreneur and he would go out and buy a generator and set it up and serve a small neighborhood. And by a small neighborhood, I mean 5 or 6 blocks. And he would literally fire this generator up and sit there and watch. And when either the frequency started to drop, meaning load was coming up on the generator, or the voltage started to drop, he would actually throttle the generator up. And when the frequency started to go too fast or the voltage got too high, he would throttle the generator back. And when customers turned off their lights for the night, he would shut the generator down and then come back in the morning and start it all over again. But the generators needed to follow the load. The load was going to do whatever it was going to do, and the generators had to track it, and that was called dispatch. When you put all of this together, it was called the central station model. And down at the bottom of this slide, there's a kind of graphic representation. You make the power with the generator. You step it up to high voltage because you're distant from your customers. You step it down to a useful voltage for them, and then it goes to the end users. And the generators had to track the sum of what all the end users were doing at a single instant, and that was called dispatch. So this is the central station model, and it resulted in a very vertically integrated industry. Now, I use the example of the fella who would go in and put a small generator in. That really happened. There were probably in the Midwest alone around 1895, there were probably 5,000 or 6,000 utilities. And each, a city like Duluth, for instance, it was a kind of a case study. Duluth had about 10,000 people living in it. They had 15 utilities serving it. And each one served its own little area. Well, because the bigger generators were more efficient, that began to get some consolidation. But initially, it was a vertically integrated industry. You owned the generation, transmission, distribution to your end customers. And it was highly fragmented. There were literally tens of thousands of these things nationwide. And it was all dominated by the central station model. You had to make power when you needed it, and you dispatch for your customers. That led to, when I came into the business, people were thinking about, especially engineers, were thinking about having a continent spanning transmission system that all generators and all utilities and customers were hooked to. And you dump power in, and utilities would draw power out. And that would allow you to have the most efficient generation. And anyway, so that's where we were about 1970. So what happened? Well, first, the industry is still fragmented, but it's not as fragmented as it used to be. Even as early as 1981, we had over 400 investor-owned utilities. Today, we've got a little under 50 today. I prepared this particular slide about 3 years ago, and there is still consolidation going on in the investor-owned world. Now, the investor-owned serve about 80% of the total load, and that's whether you look at customer count or megawatts. Cooperatives, there's about 800 of them. They serve 10% of the total load. They will tell you that they're the largest, and their claim is that they serve 60% of the land mass of the United States, and that is true. The co-ops were created to serve communities and customers that were not economic to serve otherwise. So, when you look at a cooperative model, its governance is different, its size is very different, and its cost profile is very different. There are over 2,000 municipals in the United States today. There's actually like 2,600, about 2,000 are members of APPA, and they serve about 10% of the total load. The largest one, and people always get this wrong, they ask me, the largest one is, anybody guess? PREPA. That's the organization that serves Puerto Rico. It is the largest public power system in America. Second largest is LADWP, and then Long Island Lighting. It kind of goes from there. To the south of us, Seattle, Snohomish, and Tacoma are all in the top 20 in the United States. So public power is big here in Washington. In the Midwest, not as big. There are dozens and dozens of municipals in Kentucky, and they only serve probably 7 or 8% of the total load in the state. Most of Kentucky is served by co-ops. No, come on. So what happened? Well, regulations changed. When you look at it, in 1936, there was the Edison Electric Companies. The Edison Electric Companies comprised about 95% of the investor-owned utilities. So that was a series of holding companies that were started by Thomas Edison and pretty much ran the utility industry. Congress passed a law called PUCA, which broke up the Edison companies. It didn't get enacted. I mean, it was enacted in 36. It didn't get executed until after World War II. And really, the Edison companies were broken up in the 1950s. Beginning in the 1960s, a lot of different things were happening. One, we had this thing called combined heat and power, or cogeneration. And that's where a customer, because of their process, ends up generating electricity, and occasionally they generate more than they can consume. Now, the host utility for that customer said, I'm not buying your power. You want to go ahead and generate it, that's fine, but I'm not going to wheel your power, I'm not going to buy it, I'm not can do anything. PURPA was passed in the 1970s that actually forced utilities to buy that power. Starting in the 1960s, we had a series of outages that happened. Famous one in New York, and they've gone on into this century. And we had a huge blackout, I think, in 2003. We had another one on the West Coast here that began down in San Diego in 2011. But all of these things forced Congress and FERC and other organizations to get into the utility business. And then in addition to that, you had things like Enron that came into it, and that, you had Sarbanes-Oxley and all of the other different regulations that got passed. Now, at the same time all that was happening, the legislation changed. And you think about here, the biggest change that I can point to is I-937. That's where the state of Washington said, look, we're going to get directly involved in the utility business, and we're going to tell them, here's what kind of renewable power you have to take. There are hundreds of examples of that. And then think about all of the laws that got passed in federal Congress, giving subsidies to solar power, to wind power, giving DOE money to start funding tidal generation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the legislation changed radically. And a big part of that was the public sentiment changed. Now, the easiest way to talk about this is Commissioner Grant, I'm going to pick on you because you already know the answer to this. Today, who is the face of the environmental movement worldwide?
Greta Thunberg.
Exactly. Now, what does Greta know about the environment? She's a teenager. She may be 20 now, and sailed around the world on a sailboat her folks bought her, and that literally is her claim to fame. And the answer is, it doesn't matter. The public sentiment has changed radically. What we need to think about is that while that's changed, it's changed unevenly around the world. Some parts of the world, some countries in the world, some regions in some countries care deeply about certain things, one way or the other. And to give you an example of one extreme, I come from coal country when I worked in Kentucky. They really they want to continue digging and burning coal. That is a public sentiment there. That is a far cry from what you experience here in California. So even in one country, you have really disparate public sentiment. And the technology's changed radically. So you think about how power is made, and solar panels are the big example. In the 1960s, solar panels existed, but only one organization used them, and that was NASA. Now they used them there's some technical reasons why they used them, but they could afford to. Cost really wasn't the object. Today, everybody uses solar panels. They're used at utility scale. Customers use them. They're on various appliances. They're on the roofs of some cars that are electric. It's a ubiquitous technology. Wind technology was nowhere. It literally was windmills to draw water out of farm wells when you look at the 1940s. Today, it's a far cry from that. We have huge, efficient windmills. I believe the biggest ones available now are 13 megawatts per mill, and the hub height is over 150 meters. So you're looking at a thing that's, the hub stands at 500 feet. These things are truly enormous, and they would generate, a single one of those windmills cranking would generate more than half the power that we need as a utility. These things are gargantuan, and they're cost effective. So the technology has changed, but more than on the generation side, for customers, it's changed. You think about today, many utilities have smart meters, and in your house behind that smart meter is a smart refrigerator and smart dishwasher and smart washing machine. Those things can all talk to your meter, or you can have them all talk to a single app on your computer, and you can set them so that the refrigerator cycles to take advantage of low cost power, that the car in your garage charges when power is cheap. So, that relies on the utility sending pricing signals, but all of that is done through technology and software, and that has changed radically when you think of since 1970. And last but not least, the markets themselves have developed. Here in the West, this is not necessarily true, but in other parts of the country, it really is. Here in the West, we still operate the way the power industry did back in the 1950s. If you want to buy power, you go out bilaterally and you find someone who generates power and wants to sell it to you, sign a contract with them, And then you contract with all of the transmission owners between you and them. And that's how you buy and sell power. Other parts of the country, it's developed into an organized market. There are several big ones, but there's PJM, New York ISO, New England ISO, and MISO, which covers the middle part of the country. And those markets have literally thousands of generators bidding into them every minute of every day, and thousands of utilities and customers drawing out of them. So you have spot market prices, you have day ahead prices, you have long-term contracts that you can sign. All of that can be done through an organized market, and then you pay a postage stamp to get the power to your doorstep, and you can deliver it to your customers. So the markets have changed radically, and I submit to you they will change here in the West. It's just one of those unfortunate things. We're a little bit further behind the rest of the country, but you'll see it. And this caused somewhat of consolidation among the utility industries, but more importantly, it caused what we call vertical disintegration. So utilities ended up getting rid of a lot of their generation. Independent generators, they call them merchant generators, were formed up. And it allowed, people that just wanted to be in the distribution business to be there. There are companies that do nothing but run electric transmission, and there's companies that do nothing but run electric generation. Now there are companies that do all three, and there are companies that do 2 out of 3. For instance, here at Whatcom, we do the transmission and the distribution. We don't do the generation, so we're not vertically integrated. The other thing that this resulted in, and this is more of a result of the technology and the laws changing, customers now have choice. In fact, they have extreme choice. They can choose to generate their own power and leave the grid altogether. We'll talk about that. But also it's led to market power. Customers can now get together and they can go ahead and say, wait a minute, I want to buy power from this, from that hydro installation. And there are people called aggregators that get hundreds of customers together and give them a voice. So there is now market power in the hands of customers that never existed before. So the economic system from the utility point of view has changed. So this is the effect of vertical disintegration. So essentially, if you're an investor-owned utility, you've got to have profit. So then you have to have generation plus profit, transmission plus profit, or distribution plus profit. If you're a public entity, profit can be 0. But again, you can have different companies doing only generation, only transmission, only distribution, or any mix of the above. And that determines the rate that gets charged to a customer. Now, this is the utility and the regulator point of view. The customer point of view has changed, and this is profound. What this inequality says is that as long as it costs me more to generate my power than to buy it from you guys, I'll buy it from you guys. The minute it costs less for me to generate that power myself, I don't need you anymore. So this is an equation or an inequality of existence for utilities. If this inequality is not satisfied, customers look at it and say, why should I pay those guys? And this is kind of a profound statement of market power by customers. And you look at what generation sources are today. And I will submit to you that when you look at distributed sources over here, these are ones that are available to customers directly. They tend to be less thermally efficient than the big utility sources. But that gap has closed radically from what it was in the 1880s and 1890s. And when you go back to this inequality, what that means is that the cost of generation at the utility scale is closing in on the cost of self-generation, vice versa. The self-generation cost is getting closer to the generation cost. And that puts pressure on everything else you see here, the cost of transmitting, distributing, and profit. So when you look at these distributed sources, one thing I want you to notice is a lot of them are not dispatchable. In other words, in the old days, we fired up the generation to track the load. Now you can't do that, but technology allows you to dispatch the load to track the generation. The other thing that's different today than before is we now have storage, and storage is becoming a big deal. And I'll get back to that. So what's impacting our industry? And by our industry, I do mean that. We have a foot in that industry, and we have to pay attention to this. Storage is getting less expensive, and there are more and different types of storage available. It's not just batteries, but there's all kinds of gravitational storage, there's pumped hydro, there's all kinds of things that you can do. Hydrogen, the costs of making hydrogen, storing it, and using it are coming down. That I expect to continue. All non-carbon generation except nuclear is getting cheaper at the distributed level and at the utility level. And you see this in people going to, when I was working in Kentucky, actually signing a solar contract was the lowest cost option for long-term power supply for customers. That wasn't true 10 years ago. It is true today. It was cheaper than coal. Nuclear, though, it's a different story there. It's interesting. It's non-carbon. It's dispatchable, but it's still quite expensive, and we're not sure whether or not the cost is dropping. Small modular nukes may drive the cost down per unit. I think they will. I hope they will, but they may not. And it's going to get more and more expensive to comply with all the regulations around carbon. And finally, and this is a point that masks a problem. So since 2008, we've had declining or flat consumption in most US electric markets since the Great Recession. And what that's meant is that most utilities have not had to buy a lot of new generation or upgrade their transmission and distribution, but that's an issue. So I want to switch to the legal and regulatory. We've talked about increasing regulation on carbon. There are really strong incentives for certain renewables, and by that I mean wind and solar. There's a production tax credit for wind that actually causes our local markets to go negative from time to time, and there's an investment tax credit on solar, which makes it more cost effective for homeowners and businesses to invest in solar. Since we don't pay taxes, we don't get benefit of the credit, so it doesn't necessarily help us. But there are no real strong incentives for hydro or tidal. There are a few things DOE does, but mainly the incentives are focused on solar and wind. Markets are beginning to mature and automate. And when I talk about automation, you got to think about back, you think about buying and selling stocks back in the 80s or 90s. That was an expensive, time-consuming thing to do. That has all been automated now. And if you go to Schwab or TD Ameritrade or any of the big traders, it's usually $0 or a very small fee to trade in the stocks. And that's because the whole thing has been automated. It's actually, a competitive point for them to offer that at a low cost. The power markets are going to evolve the same way. As they get more and more automated, take more and more of the cost out of it, and they get easier and easier to operate. Now, I don't think that it'll be free to trade power in these markets because of how they're built structurally, but the costs are going to go down and the ease of transacting in these markets is going to get much greater. And then finally, the utility governance is directly involved in this shift to low carbon. When I arrived at Seattle in 2006, they were the first net neutral utility in the entire country. And the reason, maybe the entire world, the reason that they were set up that way is because their governance, the Seattle City Council said, 2004, you shall do this. And they went ahead and did it. So it's important to think about that. We've got 3 commissioners here. You are the governance of this utility. And what you do matters on this. So staff can be directed to do almost anything, and we'll chase after it. Just recognize that across our industry, the electric utility industry, there are those different forms of governance, and they all have different objectives. Public sentiment, we've talked a little bit about this. I will tell you that in many markets, customers want green power. It was actually an economic development issue in Kentucky. People wouldn't build their factories in Kentucky unless we could tell them that a certain percentage, usually it was 20 or 25% of their energy, would come from non-carbon sources. Otherwise, it didn't fit their corporate philosophy, and they just wouldn't do it. In addition to that, there's an increasing share of power generated behind the meter. Locally, we see that in the number of homes that have solar panels on their roofs, the number of businesses that run with solar or combined heat power. That's typically where you see it. And you're going to see a lot more of that in the future. The other thing you're going to see is storage behind the meter. So now I just want to shift gears a little bit. These are all announcements that have happened in the last year and a half. And when I talk to a large live audience in the same way, I always ask them, after they review all of these things, and the latest one that I saw, and I just stopped collecting them after this, was Rolls-Royce has announced they're going all electric by 2030. They're also developing an all electric airplane. But Rolls-Royce, of all people, if they're doing it, they're saying all electric by 2030. I turn now and I ask the audience, do you believe that at some point you're going to not be able to buy new reciprocating engine cars, fossil fuel cars? And usually when I ask that, the audience says, well, yeah, someday. And then I go and I say, all right, well, let's figure out what day someday is. And typically, I'll just go around and say 2025, nobody raises their hand, 2030, nobody, 2035, few, 2040 is usually where majority of people start. And usually everybody has their hand up by the time you hit 2060 or 2070. So the consensus of every crowd is that someday we're going to get there. And it seems to me that it's probably in the 2040 to 2050 range, where you're not going to be able to buy a new fossil fuel vehicle unless it's a hobby car. Jay Leno will always be able to buy a car for his garage. He'll have to buy barrels of the fuel for it and run them. There will be a few people like that where it's a hobby, but the average consumer won't be able to buy a vehicle that's fossil fuel. And some people at Berkeley took a look at this and they said, well, gosh, look at penetration rates and all that. And the two things I want you to look at on this graph, first, right here, and you'll notice from about 2007, 2008, flat or declining after a century of increasing power load. And this is 4,000 terawatt hours. This is how much power, or how much energy the United States consumes each year. And it's been pretty constant for 12, 13 years. If you start looking at very high penetration rates of electric vehicles, you get to somewhere shy of 8,000 terawatt hours by 2060. And that's double the energy that we're sending through the power system today. I took a look at it from a different perspective. I said, well, I don't want to worry about penetration rates. Just let's assume that all the vehicles by 2060 are converted over and recognize that there'll be a small percentage that don't. And you only use the number of vehicles we've got on the road today. So we just took the amount of gasoline that was burned and converted it into electrical energy. And we came up with, in Kentucky, we would have to increase throughput on our system by 24%. The other extreme is California, at nearly 50%. And the nation as a whole was at 30%. Well, not daunted by that, we took a look at all transportation and fossil. So this is all diesel, propane, everything else. We went ahead and converted it and got the same look at it. You'd have to have 45% increase in Kentucky, 84%, almost 85% in California, and across the United States, over 50% increase in throughput. But it doesn't stop there. The other big source of greenhouse gases comes from buildings, and you're heating air and water in buildings. So we took one further step and looked at, well, what if you convert all fossil fuel and had to bring it through the electric system? And the answer is you're close to 13,000 terawatt hours. Now that's important because that is triple the energy that we put through our electric system today. So the last 10 years, we haven't been required as an industry to make big capital investments. What this tells me is that we're going to have to make enormous capital investments in the future, because all of that energy is going to flow through some part of our electric system sometime in the future. As I said, one of the big wild cards in all this is storage. You can store energy a whole bunch of different ways. 5 years ago, if I asked, what's the largest form of electrical storage, people who knew would say pump storage, and they were right. And 5 years ago, this was about 88% of humanity's electric storage. Today, it's closer to 90%, dropping fast. And the reason is because there's an awful lot of batteries out there. And there's all kinds of other ways to store energy. Compressed air is a very viable way of doing it. If we can have a long talk on that. But another very viable way is literally to split water into hydrogen. And that's elemental storage. And that's what I have down here at the bottom. And when you look at why you'd want to do that, so this is kind of a busy chart, but on the left side here, you've got all the use cases. So the easiest one to explain is arbitrage. Arbitrage means buy low and sell high. So arbitrage for storage looks like, well, you go in the morning when it's cheap, like 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and you store the energy. And then in the afternoon on a warm summer day, it's expensive and you dump it back in the system. So that's what arbitrage looks like. All of these other ones over here are short duration. So you're looking at voltage support, frequency regulation, various kind of wind support. And then when you look at long-term stuff, it's interseasonal storage, summer versus fall, spring versus summer, or seasonal storage where you generate more in the summer than you need and you need it in the winter. So you have to store it for up to 6 months. So on the right side are the different ways you can store energy. So you've got batteries here, and this one I would actually extend out to the week, and it's up much larger than 1 gigawatt now. Some of the batteries have gotten very, very large. This chart, I think, is from 2019, but a lot of the data came from 2017 and 18. When you look at very long-term storage, you see hydrogen and compressed air and pumped hydro. The compressed air has to do with finding salt domes and pressurizing them. The pumped storage means you need to build lakes, and they need to be at different elevations. And I submit to you, permitting issues around that are pretty onerous. So that's why I say when I look at the two things, I see batteries and I see hydrogen. Batteries for shorter term, hydrogen for longer term. I'll also tell you that hydrogen is a really good solution for long distance transportation. So think trucks or driving 300-400 miles before you need to fuel up. So finally, this brings me to my predictions. These are the prognostications. So I think that carbon's going to come out of the generation mix, not entirely in the next 20 years, but almost entirely. We're going to have storage everywhere. People are going to have it in their garages. There's going to be vehicle to grid technologies. People have talked about that a lot, but it's going to be much more possible and in some cases desirable. So storage is going to be a big deal. The hydrogen economy will be born. Now, I've actually had a conversation on this with Commissioner Dashmani. The hydrogen economy has already been born. It's been born down in Southern California. It's been born in Birmingham, England, and in Dusseldorf, I believe, or maybe it's Dresden in Germany. And these are areas where we're actually converting the pipelines to put hydrogen in them, converting the appliances at the end in Birmingham, England. And in Southern California, they're running pipelines out to essentially filling stations. So the hydrogen is piped to locations where then it's transferred into vehicles. It's not used in homes or anything, but they're using it to fuel vehicles in Southern California. You can buy an actual hydrogen fuel cell vehicle from Honda called the Clarity. It's a model they sell, and it's only for sale in Southern California, but they do have filling stations down there so you can get around. So hydrogen will be here. It's going to be a part of the solution. Is it the whole solution? I don't think so. Markets are going to continue to develop. I talked about that. They're going to get more efficient. Some customers will rely only on the grid for backup. Some will leave the grid altogether. The electric grid is going to become our gas station, folks. And what this means is that one way or another, all of the energy that flows into transportation today, it's fossil fuels. At some point in the future, it's going to flow from the electric grid to vehicles, whether it goes directly into storage and batteries, or whether it's an intermediary step where the grid helps create the hydrogen that then goes into the vehicles. Either way, that energy is going to flow through the grid, and the grid will be our gas station. We're going to need massive T&D investment. I just don't have any other way to put this. Now, a lot of utilities are kind of, they're looking at this kind of deer in the headlights. When you've got this kind of throughput increase, one thing to think about is you got more sales to cover it on. So some of the capital investment is just going to make sense, and it's going to be fairly easy to do. Some of it's going to be hard to justify, and regulators are going to be loath to do some of it. So utilities are going to be facing greatly increasing demand, and they're going to have difficulty building infrastructure to serve it. In the very, very long term, I predict, this is not a forecast, this is a prediction. I predict that hydrogen will be the single largest load on our entire electric grid when you add up all of the places that make hydrogen. There won't be any carbon sources left in the continental United States, including transportation, with the possible exception of air transport. All of the solutions that I've seen so far for electric airplanes are relatively short distance, 300 to 500 miles, and relatively small. So I'm not sure, but we might still have fossil fuel for jets, but that would be, from a species point of view, a very minor contribution compared to today. The grid itself won't look like the grid we know today, this continent spanning transmission system and all that. We'll have a good transmission system, but there will be tiny microgrids everywhere, and they'll be tightly interlinked. And so when you have a disturbance on the high voltage system, like we did in 2011 that dumped San Diego wouldn't be dumped. In fact, the folks down in Southern California wouldn't even have known that that outage happened. The utility would have done the line repairs, everything would have been fine. And that's kind of the advantage of microgrids and mini grids all tied together. They can support themselves. We'll need less rare earths for electrical storage. I think more storage in hydrogen means less lithium, less other chemistry that you have for batteries. The electrolysis and the fuel cells require rare earths. So there's some rare earths that are still needed, just less than for electrical storage. I think that's important to think about, just because a lot of the rare earths are mined in places where, frankly, they don't like us. And last but not least, I think that the profit is going to be completely removed from the transmission and distribution system and utilities. And that goes back to the customer point of view. If you look at this, if the cost of self-generation begins to approach utility scale generation, which it is, it's going to squeeze all of these things. And the first thing that's going to go is the profit. And I think that at some point, there will be some investor owns that look at this and say, gosh, we don't belong in this part of the business, whether it's the distribution or the transmission or both. And I think over the next 50 years, you're going to see many of these utilities get out of that business. So I think that's where this whole thing is going. I think it's going to be an exciting time. I'm actually sorry that I'm not starting my career now, and that I'd have the next 40 years to work through this instead of maybe only the next 5 to 10. But it's going to be an exciting time for all of us, and it's going to have a lot to do with everything in our society. So with that, I've ranted and raved for about 30 minutes, and I'm going to shut up and see if there are any questions.
Chris,
Mike.
thank you for your presentation. There was a lot of information there that, I wasn't aware of. When I was married, my wife and I, back in the early 70s, we bought a brand new Toyota for $2,500. Brand new Toyota for over $50,000. We bought our first house, 5 acres and a 3-bedroom house, 5 acres for $21,000. And today, $500,000 possibly up. Cost factors for all this. Has anyone ever done the cost on all this?
So I think I can't give you a definitive answer on that. I think the short answer is yes, people look at pieces of it. I'm not really sure that anybody's put the whole network together, because it would depend. You've got too many forecasts that you're stacking on top of each other, and you end up with an error bar that just gets absurd when you get out towards the end. One thing I will tell you, and this is based on research that we did when I worked at Snohomish, in the 1950s and 60s, about 3% of household income went to energy in Washington State. By 2017, it had declined to around 1%. So, at the same time, you're feeling all these inflation pressures, the actual share of the family budget that was going to energy declined. And a lot of that was the efficiency that was built into the utility industry, whether it's investor owned or public. We were doing a lot of things right as an industry. I don't know whether or not that trend will continue, but I think it will, because there are so many pressures on the pricing. Now, there's a lot of money that goes into the electric industry today that goes in the form of subsidies. So it's money that flows in that we pay in our taxes, but it doesn't necessarily go to the family energy budget. So there's all kinds of costs that are involved in this that come in very, very different ways than what we've seen traditionally. which just complicates things. So I guess in answer to your question, not that I'm aware of, I don't think anybody's really priced this out. I'll go look at DOE and see if somebody there has, or NRO or Idaho National Labs. Somebody may have looked at that, but I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, well, I'm all supportive of all the new, I mean, when my wife and I built our home, started in 79, 1980, we built one of the, in fact, I couldn't even get a permit because I built a 2x6 house, 2-foot center, R19 in the walls, R32 in the ceiling. And the county wouldn't give me a permit because they thought I was an idiot to even build a house like this, because who ever heard of anything? I tried to stay off the grid and I couldn't find solar, it wasn't even available. And there was only wind turbine back then, and it was so poor that technology was so poor, you needed a wind like today to even generate enough power. So there's been a lot of progress and a lot of good stuff that's happened. But eventually the cost has to catch up. I don't know how to get around to looking at, cleaner energy, green choices, whatever, without it being in a place where it can be affordable. The last thing I want to do is put a financial burden on anybody, So anyhow, that's where I'm at. But I'm always open to these new ideas.
Well, I really wanted you guys to see what I was going to talk to Western about today. So that's the tool.
Yeah, I have a thought, and where you got to in terms of conclusion is pretty, from my perspective, pretty robust. Exactly what happens, for example, with hydrogen is something we'll see. I helped develop fuel cell technology, and I helped design and install the first hydrogen fueling station in the country. So I'm knowledgeable about that subject, and I'm more skeptical than most people on hydrogen's market penetration. But I'm open to being wrong, because the world changes and technology evolves, and so anyway, one of the things that you didn't explicitly state as a conclusion, but as a conclusion I'd like to draw from the conclusions, and that is that we're looking at a system that has a lot more complexity in it. And certainly there's plenty of folks who are trained as systems engineers working in the utility industry. But this evolution is going to tax that mindset to its fullest potential. And so, for example, the number of economic participants in the utility industry of a particular county, whether that's in California or in Washington, there's a lot more participants in Whatcom County. There's a lot more participants in counties all over the country. So we all have to work together. And there's the grid's flowing in multiple directions, and there's a tremendous need to manage all that complexity, manage it well. And I'm just recognizing that, and I'm just wondering, what's the next step for us? How do we start being a contributor to a world that's increasingly complex, working with our partners, working with the community to contribute something that addresses reliability issues, that addresses this complexity, hopefully helps achieve the best possible affordability, and so on and so forth. So the thing is, figuring out what do we do as a PUD to support this, be a beneficial contributor to this evolution. And I want some of your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, the first step, in my opinion, is education. So people need to know the train's coming so that they have the opportunity to get off the tracks, or they're going to get run over by it. So that's part of what I'm starting with. Secondly, we've got to recognize that in terms of being a contributor in the electric space in Whatcom County, we're relatively small, and I'm kind of being kind on that point. Compared to Puget, we're just kind of a fly speck. On the water side, it's the other way around. We're pretty significant in terms of total water volume, and it kind of matters. So, part of it is education, and then part of it is we need to sit down, and by we, I mean 3 commissioners, myself, and maybe a couple of other people, staff, and chart out what we can do, what it would take. Now, clearly, part of it's going to be working with Puget and, helping Puget achieve some of these things locally. Part of it may be a little bit adversarial. So, we need to be thoughtful in that. And really, we need to have that discussion offline someplace in an executive session or something. But really, the first step is education and getting people to know, where they don't already, that these changes are going to be happening, and that if they don't think that it's going to affect them personally, they're probably wrong. And it's gonna. The question is when. How long is it going to take? I think that the utilities as an industry, all of us, investor owns, publics, and co-ops, it's in our best interest to make this whole thing transparent, if not literally invisible to our customers. Now, I think it's going to be rough enough, it won't be invisible, but our customers need to know what's going on. So really, back to my first point, education, I think is where we need to start.
Yeah, I very, very much support that. And so look forward to maybe a short form of your presentation to support my meetings with people in the community to kind of lay out where things might be headed, so that I can support the education effort to the best of my ability.
I'd be happy to work with you on that.
Yeah.
So Commissioner Grant, unless there are any other questions, the general manager's report is at last concluded.
Thank you, Chris, and good luck with your presentation today at Western. I know there's a lot of good interest in the community around that. So any other questions from my fellow commissioners for Chris before we move on to commissioner reports? Okay, Commissioner Murphy, do you want to go first with your report?
Let's see. I'll call it the honor of sitting down with Chris and talking over, some of his thoughts and where he thinks about us, and we got to get to know each other. So that was a very good time. I appreciate your time, Chris, on that. Did sit down with Andrew. He shared a lot about broadband, made it a little bit more clear for me, and I'm hoping that soon he'll have the opportunity, as you were saying, Christine, to give a presentation and make it more clear to the public what we can and can't do. As the rest of you, I sat on the energy meeting with PUD. I saw both that you were attending. The government, I sat on that, and the board of directors, and I'm looking forward to sitting on the Whatcom Marine Symposium coming up too. I won't talk about the energy because both of you are there, but a lot of time is spent on the governance discussing from a Joy, I think it's pronounced Ditto, from APPA out of Washington, DC, about our grid system and how behind it is, and that needs a lot of catch up to meet the future needs on the grid. And so they're talking about how a lot of things are ran by switches, they're not digital, and cyber security, we are just asking for it. So I was quite surprised that I think as a country, we should really get busy if we're going to meet some deadlines of 2030 or 35 or 40 and on. There was also talk too about the capital budget. They're still working on that, so there's not much information upgrade on that. But we'll put a board meeting. Talked a lot about, George talked about our meetings in Zoom, how we could possibly go to April in-person meetings, which he's hoping to do, but we are still waiting to hear what the governor is going to do. Because of time, I think I got notes, pages and pages, but I'll stop there unless you have any questions.
No, thank you, Commissioner Murphy. Commissioner Deshmani?
So the main thing I'll talk about here is water related meetings. I attended the watershed management team meeting getting ready for the watershed management board, and also had a follow-up conversation with Steve and Rebecca on that subject. And the subject I want to introduce is storage. As part of the bigger subject of water supply solutions, which means, some people say there's plenty of water, but I don't like to say that there's plenty of water in Whatcom County, and the reason is because that's like saying there's plenty of oxygen, and if one day I run out of oxygen, it's not a pleasant situation. So really, what we need to think about is July, August, September. Well, there's not plenty of water in July, August, and September in many occasions. So in those situations, we have to find ways to have alternative or supplemental water supply. Well, where can that happen? Well, that can happen through storage. That can be using well water, or also referred to as groundwater, on its own or in cahoots with storage. That storage can be filled through a variety of mechanisms. That storage can also be in kind of not what we would typically call storage, but in working with wetlands and soil ecology for the purpose of infiltrating that water. So it's may not actually be a pond or a lake. Maybe it's actually visually hidden from the surface, but still effectively storage. So regarding this, I feel PUD has already sanctioned a couple of studies in the area of storage. I'm going to review those again, and then identify probably well in advance of the March 22nd water in-depth discussion that we're planning to have at the commission, some input to our water team, ask some of the questions that we should be able to shed some light on in March. So that's something I could take a moment to break and hear from the commission on that. Basically to help steer our conversation on the 22nd as it relates to water supply solutions.
So Commissioner, can I make a couple observations?
Yeah, please.
So you're right. I know that the utility has studied this at a very high level, and I recall talking to General Manager Jilk about this. I think there were 6 different scenarios that we looked at, including tank storage and pond storage at various locations, and what we would have to do with the piping. I don't know that any of those really got to the point where you could reliably cost them out. Mm-hmm. And then, before I'd want to make a recommendation to a water board, I'd want to know how much it costs. And I'd want to know what impact that would have on rates and kind of work through that. That's all I'll say on that. I know we're not ready for that today. I don't know if we could do that in a month. That might not be a reasonable thing.
Yeah, no, what I'm just the Watershed Management Board is a place to just let people know that this is something the PUD is aware of this interest in the community. The county executive talked about it. Folks in the small space cities have interests that coincide with this. And just to let the board know that it's something that the PUD is investigating and continues to investigate. And I think it's way premature to report anything or recommend anything to the board, but certainly there's work to be done on our part. And figuring out what kind of a plan of work we can go back to the Watershed Management Board with for their support to not say what the solution is, but a plan of work to develop some of the answers that they would want to hear. Steve and Rebecca, you may also want to help complete my sentences there.
I don't know if I can complete your sentences, but I do think that as you and I and Rebecca discussed last week about this topic, is that there are a number of places in the Watershed Management Board's 5-year work plan where storage has been identified as one of the options for providing water resources, water supply. We also talked briefly about the recent approved county, the climate action plan, and there are several places within that climate action plan that storage is being studied. The other is that we have to, as we bring this potentially back to the commission and to the Watershed Management Board, we have to be very clear as to where our interest lies and what the possible movement forward on identifying much more clearly which of those, if any of those 6 storage areas that were identified by Chuck Lindsay in that recent study. And we've done, I think, 3 other storage studies over the years since starting back in 1992, and identify where those may fit into some of the other work that's being done by the Watershed Management Board. Starting last year with bringing Paula Cooper Moore, who is the head of flood management with Whatcom County, bringing her into a much more in-depth discussion about working with the Watershed Management Board's 5-year work plan in terms of looking at possible areas along the main stem and even some of the tributaries where she will be dealing with flooding issues. Are there options to consider off-river storage for flood purposes, flood management purposes? Could some of those areas also be included in researching options for storage for reuse of water or pumping back into streams? So all I'm saying is that, the other thing is that I think that we have to be very careful. I think, as Chris had indicated, where will the money come from? And I know that Commissioner Deshmani, we've talked several times about getting the federal government involved, in terms of funding for some of these larger projects. But even doing an in-depth analysis of any of these storage areas and getting to a true cost estimate, and then deciding whether or not you're going to move on any of those areas to consider permitting and so forth. We're talking quite an extensive budget. So we just have to be very strategic as to why we're identifying specific areas, how they fit into the bigger picture, and then identify funding to move forward. So.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Steve. And it's speaking for myself. It's my current feeling that the work that we do to support in-stream flows, particularly as it relates to storage and water supply solutions, is work that is in support of the federal government's obligation to treaty rights. And as a result, we should get the support of the federal government because it's ultimately their responsibility to make sure there's enough water in the streams. So, I mean, that's just speaking for myself here, and recognizing that there might be different perspectives and views on that.
I don't disagree with you, Commissioner. I think that it's just important to make sure that as we're, maybe this is not a good metaphor, but painting the picture, you know, colored by number, you know, paint by number picture, we need to know where we fit in terms of this concept and this idea of storage, so that we, even if we enlist state and federal funding and possibly county funding for projects, that we know where it fits in. That's all, and we have to be quite strategic about that. That's all.
The other topic, we talked about broadband, so I shared what I had to share about broadband. The other topic is on the electricity front. I attended the Wapouta energy meetings, and Christine, you had suggested that I take notes on Rich Anderson's from Tacoma Power presentation on demand side management, but I don't know if you also was able to hear that whole thing, but I can share my notes from that.
I was actually able to catch most of it.
Okay.
Yeah. And
so his presentation was on heat pumps and building electrification. And I'll just comment on what it made clear to me that this subject of demand response, which you and I both believe is really important, and you've really made it a priority, and glad that the Wapoutas listening to your input and addressing it at least with the presentation. But I'm realizing that to do this subject of demand response, it has to be not an effort driven by individual components, because what I discovered is that the efficacy of heat pump related demand response depended on so many other things going right. And I'm wondering if that's true as much about water heaters, perhaps not, maybe less so with water heaters or other things. But I feel like there's a need for a systemic view on managing the load. And I don't know if that's happening, but that's my reflection on that presentation. And that's my report.
great. As you can probably tell, I'm in dire need of electricity right now. So I had to get a little closer to a wall. So sorry for the wobbly video. So yeah, I thought that the energy, so just to do my report, I did the telecom and energy Wapouta meetings. And I thought that the energy discussion was a really good one, particularly about electrification. And I agree with you, Atul, that I think we all have a lot more to learn. And I thought it was a great first step for Nicholas to invite his former colleague from Tacoma Power. And I've suggested to George that we might ask Saul Griffith to join in the future as a guest speaker, who is an engineer that's doing a lot of work on electrification. And so just so we can all continue to learn. And I think what I learned was just how important the strategic planning process is for Wapouta in April to inform the legislative session. So definitely gonna want to make sure that we're all involved in that. And, but it was great to hear from other PUDs about their interest in this. And, as far as the telecom meeting, again, just hearing from Stephanie at WPUDA, the number of grants that are going to be available, from the feds too. So there's a pot of 40, I have my notes here. I think it's close to $40 billion that will then be distributed to state broadband offices. So she mentioned a few different pots of money, and I know Andrew was on that call, but I just think it is really important that we're tracking all of those. We understand eligibility, we understand pre-application. These federal grants are incredibly complicated and take months of preparation sometimes. So I said it before, but I'm saying it again because I think it's the number one thing we can do to improve broadband infrastructure in our county is get money to build the infrastructure. I mentioned a few other things that I've been up to on broadband. We had a broadband steering committee meeting, which was Chris's first time in that meeting. Chris and I also did a Zoom with the Public Works, some of the members of the Public Works Department for the city of Bellingham to talk about the carbon reduction initiative and kind of the partnership with the PUD, and Mayor Fleetwood joined for part of that. So it's great to see Chris, getting connected with all the different players in town. And then I think that's kind of it for me. In terms of, I mentioned I did the virtual day on the Hill with WPUDA too. So it was kind of a full two weeks here. But I think we're making good progress on a lot of fronts. So yeah, that's it. And I will be actually doing a meeting. Chris and I are doing another meeting with the port later today to continue talking through the implementation of the funding that we have.
I just on the Christine there and Mike, there was a term that you guys, one of you two may remember that came up in the telecom. I wasn't paying very close attention to it, but I wanted to make sure that I brought it up and asked about it. There is a term that they brought up for county-specific task forces or action groups. Do you remember what that was? And do we have such a group in Whatcom County? Do you remember what it was an issue that Stephanie and Nicholas brought up specifically about the need for having groups that are cross-functional within the county to increase the likelihood of success of funding. Do you know what I'm referring to, Christine?
I turned my video off because I'm looking for through my notes. And I don't know if Andrew is still on, but I know what you're talking about. It's something like broadband.
Yeah, broadband something. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if we have one. To my knowledge, we do not have one. Maybe it's just a naming thing. We call ourselves a broadband steering committee, but
yeah, that's why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah.
The state office seems to feel like it's like a prerequisite of that they're looking for in every community. Yeah, and actually the state broadband office has a term, and maybe I can find it on the website here. Andrew, can you help?
Andrew just popped on. I think he'll have the answer.
Yes, you're correct. The state broadband office on their website does have a list of broadband action teams, and early on there was mention from those funding agencies that you would score higher if you had a existing broadband action team. And when I look at their document that's hosted online, it does not indicate that Whatcom County has a existing broadband action team.
Oh, interesting.
Can we make that so?
Yeah, I mean, I'll bring it up. I can suggest that we put that on our agenda for the next meeting. Or actually, Andrew, can you just work with Gina to get that on the next agenda?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And
And yeah.
whatever budgetary approval we need, like capes for the people on the action team. Can we just fund that, whatever we need for the action?
$1 million and we're good.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great point, Atul. Thank you for mentioning that. I think the other kind of just interesting thing is that the state broadband office hasn't had a director for now 3 or 4 months. They haven't been able to fill that position, which I think just underscores how hard hiring is right now, and particularly with public broadband, because there's so much interest in it right now. So if anyone knows anyone,
I have a suggestion on
what?
on someone who I think we could nominate for that role.
Well, let the state broadband office know, or someone at.
Yeah.
So really, I think that's it for me at this point. And does anybody have anything else that they want to share during commissioner reports?
I just wanted to report, I forgot to mention in my report, Commissioner Grant, that on Monday, I've got the local loops meeting where I'm going to update the folks after my conversations with Andrew about where they fit into the county's SCC and state broadband office maps, and just give them a debrief on that subject. And then on Tuesday is the I already mentioned that I'm going to bring up getting Cogeneration to present, but the bag meeting is on Tuesday evening, so I'll be covering that next week. And I just wanted to mention those things.
Great. Commissioner Murphy?
Yeah, actually, this would be towards Chris and Steve, but Chris, is it possible to have Steve look into, as we talk about water and things, there's things that we can deal with right now, because we know that climate change, we know how this area really hurts during late August all the way through till December. People without water. I thought that for now we could maybe be a solution to people's wells if they go dry by at least providing water to them at some location where these tenders or tankers, whatever you want to call them, can come and get the water. But at least we can help ease some of the pain, because the water was quite expensive for these people. And also, I'm not aware of any any information saying where are these wells located that are going dry, and why are they going dry? I don't know if a study's ever been done. I'd like to know if there's a way that we can help these areas too, to disperse the water needed in Whatcom County to the people who need them. Besides, creating lakes and storage too. These things we should deal with now, because they're going to be back here again this year.
So, Commissioner Murphy, short answer to your question is yes. I can ask Steve to look into that with staff. Although his plate's getting pretty full again. But the other thing I'd want to remind you, if we were to offer such a thing, we need to develop a rate for it. And I don't think we have that today. So between, loading up the tankers and then the tanker transporting it, I don't know if it would be cost effective for the end use customers. And I think it'd be a case by case basis. So that's just an observation. We need to look into it, though. It may be very cost effective and we ought to do it. But
so we don't have an emergency way of supporting people that have no water. I mean, I look at one thing is, yeah, we sell water, but on the other hand, under emergency conditions, we should be here to be able to support the community too. So that's another question.
It's a good question.
Thank you.
Does that conclude commissioner reports? Okay, great. So the next thing on the agenda is our second public comment session. Anne, can you help facilitate that?
Don't see any hands raised.
Okay. Thank you. We will, I'll just double check. Yeah, we will close public comment then. And that gets us to the end of our meeting. Anything else today for the good of the order? Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining our meeting today. And that concludes our meeting. Thanks a lot.